Welcome back to the channel, guys, and I hope you guys are doing pretty good. This is going to be the day 13 of our 90 days SDET interview preparation series. If you are meeting for the very first time, hi guys, my name is Jatin and I'm a principal QA with 12 plus years of experience in automation testing and DevOps. I help QA professionals just like you transition from manual to automation testing. Now, in this 90 days SDET interview preparation series, as the title suggests, we will be focusing on important SDET interview question. Now, this whole series is for 90 days only and only because I wanted to make sure that in your 90 days notice period, you are studying these questions properly so that you are able to get a better job offer. Now, in today's class, now guys, we will be focusing only on one question. All right. And that question over here is, how do you start with automation? Are you going to focus on UI or you're going to focus on API testing first? Now, most of you guys know the answer for this particular question. What is the answer? What you should focus first? Should you focus on UI or should you focus on API? The answer is you should be focusing on APIs first. That's obvious because API is always going to give you better ROI. Your tests are going to be fast. But the reason we are focusing on this particular question is most of the time people are just aware of the term that you're supposed to use API testing first. You're not supposed to focus on UI. Okay. And in interview, they're going to say that, okay, focus on API testing first. But later on, okay, in the interview, the interviewer is going to cross-question your thinking abilities. So how this entire session has been created, we will be discussing this particular question. Along with that, all the probable questions that can be asked, okay, from this same question we will be discussing. Okay, it's going to be a fun activity. I'm pretty sure by the end of this particular class, you will be having crystal clear idea why we are choosing API testing before UI testing and all the different permutation combination questions that can come over there. All right, I hope you guys are ready. Without wasting time, let's get started. Now over here, guys, the question that was asked to the student was, how do you start your automation? Are you going to focus on API or UI? Now, one thing that we know that is the manual testing is not something that you can scale. That is practically not possible. When you are to have this deployment that is going to happen 10 to 15 times a day, you can't have human clicking through everything. Automation exists because it's going to give you speed with confidence. Now you get the speed, but confidence is only going to come into picture when your tests are concrete. They are not flaky. If you know something about UI test, whether you are writing it with your Selenium WebDriver or you're writing it with Playwright, they are a little bit brittle. Okay. Sometimes they pass, sometimes they fail. Now, API test is the only test which is a concrete test. All right. The tests are fast. Okay. It is reliable. Hence, that's the reason we are focusing on API first. But one important thing I want to discuss over here is that, see, when we are talking about your manual testing now, you will be using exploratory testing. Exploratory testing still needs to be done by human. And it's the exploratory testing which finds new bugs. Okay. So if you want to find new bugs in your application, you are supposed to do exploratory testing. Is this part clear? Now, see, the API versus UI decision matters because, as I've said, UI tests are going to be slow, brittle, and expensive to maintain. Now, why it is going to be expensive to maintain is because, see, you're supposed to find the locator, then you're supposed to create the page classes, then you're going to update your test classes. It's a hell lot of task. Okay. So if in future the UI changes, you are going to update your test. Okay. Now, if a button is not being clickable, okay, it can break like 50 other tests, right? If you're not able to log in into the application, all the other tests, okay, the dashboard test, your, like probably cart test, all those things, they are definitely going to fail. API tests are basically fast, stable, and test actual business logic. So whenever you are focusing on testing the business logic, you will be focusing on APIs. Are you getting the point? So here's this one example which I always take. See, when you are looking at a person, right now you're looking at me. So I am the UI. Okay, this entire body is basically the UI. The brain, okay, how my brain operates, what's the thinking capabilities and all, that's my API. So whenever you are supposed to judge a person, okay, what they say, never go by the cover of the book. So over here, guys, whenever you're supposed to judge a person, you're not supposed to judge them on how they look. It's really important that you start focusing on how they think, right? So the same thing happens with your application also. No matter how beautiful the UI is, but if the business logic is not correct, if the application is not working correctly, all right, that time, guys, that application is of no use. Hence, we always say that focus on business logic before you start focusing on the UI. Is this part making sense to everyone? So, the correct approach is you will be trying to automate 70% of your API test. Okay, giving you a rough figure so that you guys can remember it off. Make sure that 70% of your tests are basically API test. 20% of your test should be UI test. And whenever we are talking about the UI test, make sure you only focus on the happy flows. Okay? Because if you try to focus on the negative scenarios, you are going to have a hell lot of, time over there trying to create that scenarios and automating it off. Even if you are going to have negative test or you want to do negative testing, try to do it on the business logic layer. That is going to be far more easier and, scalable and maintainable for you guys. And 10% you will be doing your manual or exploratory testing. Is this part making sense to everyone? Now, always ask, where does the real logic lives? Now, use the testing pyramid as your framework. 70% of your tests are going to be API test, which is going to focus on the business logic, validation, and data flow. Next comes the 20%. That is going to be on UI. As I've said, you will be focusing on user journey and end-to-end browser flow. And 10% is going to be the manual exploratory testing, where we will be focusing on the edge cases as well as the new features. Is this part making sense to everyone? Now, this is something that you're supposed to talk in interview. Now, if I go to the next page, see, whenever we are trying to start automation, you should always start automation on stable, high value flow first. Okay? Now, in your application, you might have 10-15 different flows. Out of those 10-15 different flows, you're supposed to focus on the flow which generates higher revenue for your application, for your company. That should be the flow that you should be testing first or automating first. And who is going to help you understand which flow is important? Your product owner. Okay, if you're joining that particular company or any company for the very first time, you're supposed to automate a scenario. How you will be deciding which scenario to automate? You will be discussing it with the product owner. Okay, which scenario is the most used scenario? You will automate that first. Is this part clear? And with what you will be automating, focus first on API. Then you want to focus on UI. Clear? Never automate a feature whose UI is still actively changing. You will be just rewriting the test every sprint, because if the UI keeps on changing, your test is also going to get changed. You're supposed to keep on updating them, and it is going to become a nightmare for you guys. Now, here's the thing. If I said this much thing in the interview, right, the interviewer can cross-question me. Okay, and here's the cross question which I feel the interviewer can ask you. If the same functionality is testable at both API and UI level, if there is a functionality which can be tested on both API level as well as UI level, what's your call? Which layer you are going to test first? Now, based on what we have discussed over here, most of us will say that, array, we will be testing the API layer first, right? So my call would be to test at the API level with minimal UI smoke test on top. For example, you have a login API, right? Or you have a login feature. You are going to test the login API properly, thoroughly, and you will just introduce a simple smoke test for your login UI feature. Make sense? The reason is simple. As API tests are faster, more stable, and closer to the business logic, if we can validate the data is being created, updated, or deleted correctly at the API layer, I have already covered the 80% of the risk. If you are testing the API thoroughly, properly, your positive as well as the negative scenario, you are focusing on creation, updation, deletion, okay, on the API layer, you have already covered 80% of the risk of that feature, right? UI test on top just confirms the screen renders correctly for the user. So if I have focused on the API test, my API test covers the major scenarios. The UI test is just going to focus from the customer perspective, whether they are able to use the feature properly from UI. That's the reason I say the happy flow test should be focused on your UI. Is this part making sense to everyone? Think of it this way. If your API is returning the right data, but the UI is not displaying it, that's a front-end rendering issue. Okay. So if the API is returning us the correct data, but UI is not showing it off, it means the issue is with UI, not with API. Okay. And this is going to be a bug which is quick to catch with just 1 or 2 UI checks. But if we put all our effort in UI test, I am testing through more layers, making my suit slow and brittle. If I'm just going to have the UI test, I can tell my developer that I'm not able to log in into the application. Now, in order to not able to log in into the application, there can be n number of reasons, right? But if I am confident that login API is working, okay, if I'm giving my username and password correctly to the login API and I'm able to log in, it means the backend is up and running. Something is wrong with the UI. So we need to focus on the front end part of the application. I hope this part makes sense to everyone. Now remember, whenever we are focusing on APIs, the focus is the test the behavior at the API level and verify the experience on the UI. Okay. So the behavior, the business logic is always going to be tested on the API layer and the user experience is going to be tested on the UI. Perfect. Now, I want you guys to pause this particular video, quickly read these points. Okay, this is very important. Please read this part. I hope you guys have gone through this particular stuff. Now, you will notice that whenever I'm talking about API, I'm saying that the API test is fast. Okay. Now, the cross question that can come over here is, you said API testing is faster, but if the UI is what the customer uses, isn't UI testing more valuable? Right? See, we are saying over here that API test is fast, but as a customer, okay, the end user is always going to use UI. So the interviewer is asking, if user is going to use the UI, shouldn't UI testing be of a higher priority for us? Now, see, understand this part. Customer uses the UI. That is true. But the values, the data which is coming on that UI application is basically coming from the business logic. And this business logic basically sits in API. Make sense? So, whatever you're seeing the comments on the YouTube videos, you're seeing the views, likes, dislikes, and all those things, right? These features, you are viewing it from the application, right? But the data, the values which you're seeing, these values are basically coming from the backend. Are you getting the point? So if I want to be sure that the data is coming correctly, I just need to focus on the APIs. All right. If the logic is broken, no amount of the beautiful UI matters. No amount of how beautifully you have created the UI is going to matter at all. As I've said, it doesn't matter how beautiful the person is. If their thinking capabilities are dumb, okay, that relationship is not going to work out. Makes sense? So, API testing protects what truly matters, correctness of the data and the business logic. Okay? So, with API testing, you are focusing on the correctness of the data as well as the business logic. That said, UI testing is absolutely important. Customer journey, critical flow like login, checkout, form submission, these must be covered in UI. So your UI coverage, because they validate the end-to-end experience of a real user, how they're going to have it. Okay. So from the experience perspective, focus on UI test. But don't just keep on adding hell lot of tests in your UI. Okay. Your major test should always happen at the backend layer. I hope this part makes sense to everyone. Both are valuable, but they are going to serve different purpose. API test protects the business logic efficiently. UI test protects the user experience. A mature strategy needs both just in right proportion. 70% API, 20% UI. Clear? And this is something that we will be following with the testing pyramid. I hope this particular part makes sense now. All right. So this is your third question. Now the fourth question, which is really important. Suppose you are saying that, okay, we will be focusing on API testing. Now the interviewer asks you that, hey, okay, what if the API is not documented? Okay. Or there's an access restriction. You're using a third-party API and technically it's just going to give you a response. So you're not able to access that particular API. How do you handle API testing in this kind of a scenario? So this is important, guys. What if the API is not documented or access is restricted? How do you handle API testing in this kind of a scenario? I've already written it off. And if you guys have studied with me for the SDET masterclass, this scenario we have already covered it off. Okay. Now, when we are focusing on testing APIs and we don't have a documentation, what we do? That time, guys, we try to do reverse engineering. Okay. You're going to open your browser, you're going to go to DevTools, network tabs and perform the actions on the UI. You're going to log in the application. You're going to look at the network calls. You're going to observe all the API calls which are happening over there. Once those API calls you're able to see, you're going to import them in your Postman collection. Okay. And then you can do is you can actually have your document created parallelly. So you're going to capture the API calls being made, endpoint. You're going to observe the request header, the request body, the response structure. You can use tools like Postman and you can import these directly. And while you are executing the whole flow, you will be creating your own documentation as you go. Okay. Now, the thing is, see, a lot of time in interview, they ask you the question, what are the challenges that you faced in your automation framework or in your project? And the thing is, most of the time, okay, people mug up this answer and they say that locator issue. Dynamic locator was there. Okay. And then there was tables. Okay. So they used to do a lot of mapping of your table entries. So that was a little bit difficult and all. See, at one end, you are saying that API testing is important. And your major challenges is coming on UI. Doesn't make sense, right? So these kinds of answers, like you can talk about that there was API documentation was not there. And you created that API documentation. And in which scenarios generally you don't have API documentation? Generally when you're working with startups, or like if a project is just getting started, okay, having API documentation is like not the most important thing for the developers and all. So they generally just focus on creating the feature. Once the application becomes stable, that time they will focus on having the API documentation. But if it's not there, okay, you guys can take that particular ownership. You know how exactly the documentation is going to be created with Postman and all, right? That is something which is there. One more challenge that you can really talk about is the access is restricted. There will be certain APIs in your application which probably might be restricted. So if there are APIs which are restricted, so you can raise it as a risk and escalate it to the team lead or architect, because testing without APIs access is a significant gap. Now, there is an API. I don't know what is the request header and all those things. I just know that it's going to give me a response that is going to be further used by some of your components. Now, if you don't know how exactly that API is operating, it is going to create an issue. A simple example that I can give you is Google APIs. See, we probably might be using Google APIs in our application, the Google Place API. Now, I don't know like how exactly that particular API works, but I just know that data is going to come from that particular API, right? So that auto suggestions in your Uber, in your Rapido, in your Ola, right? When you start typing the locations and all, those data is technically going to come from your Google Place API. But I don't know how exactly it is going to get that data, but I just know that data is going to come. So over here, if that particular API is restricted, you really can't test that particular API. That time, what we will be doing is we will be focusing on mocking. So while that is being resolved, your focus is going to be on UI level testing, and you're going to log the limitations. If there is a staging or a mock environment available, you are going to use that. Okay. And for mocking, what you can do is you can use tools like WireMock and mock servers to create mock APIs to unblock your testing. Now, if you're using Android apps or you're testing Android apps, sometimes the APIs are restricted. You're not able to check on all those things. That time, you guys can use tools like Charles Proxy or Fiddler to intercept the API traffic when it direct access is restricted. Make sense? So these are the things that you should really be aware of in your interview. Now, I have covered 4 questions. There are more 4 questions, and these questions are, suppose, more like a scenario driven questions that can come over here. UI test catches issue that API test can't. Okay. And can you just give a concrete example over here? So over here, let's say UI test is the one which is catching the issue, but API is not able to do that. So if you have faced certain kind of scenarios, you're supposed to answer it off. How do you decide when contract testing becomes more relevant than traditional API testing? What is this traditional API testing? You are checking the response status code, response body, key value check, and all those things, the response time and all. But you need to decide when exactly contract testing is going to be involved in your project. How do you handle flaky tests early on? Do you fix them immediately or you move forward? If you join a project midway and there is already a messy automation suite, how you are going to approach this particular problem? What is going to be your first step? Now, these are going to be the 4 questions which I will be covering in the next video. The next video is going to be a members only video. So please make sure, guys, that you at least go through all these 4 questions. And if you are working in a project, I want you guys to think about all these 4 questions, okay? And see if this is an issue in your project, how will you resolve it? Do let me know your answers in the comment section. I'm going to see you guys in the next class. If you need the answers for this one, please check the YouTube Tech with Jatin membership. I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Don't forget to mark your attendance. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.